What's up, investors? Chase here from the Note MBA podcast, and this week's episode did not come out on Wednesday. It actually came out today, on Friday. Go figure. Anyway, the reason is because we had a very special guest this week, Dr. Dan Wurzelmann. He's a psychiatrist in the last few days of his residency at the University of Michigan. Why would we have a psychiatrist on a real estate podcast, you might be asking? Well, you'll have to listen to this week's episode to find out why. Spoiler alert. Overwhelm. Fear, vulnerability. This is all stuff we deal with. And that is what he brings to today's show. Check it out right now.
Got an email about 2 weeks ago that had essentially the subject line was the show has become unlistenable, which was a pretty harsh subject line. And the second I saw it come across, I pretty much dropped everything.
First, seconds, performing, non-performing? What the f***? Note buyers, when it seems like you're in this business alone, know Chase, Robert, and the rest of their tribe are at it every week. They're bringing updates from their own note businesses as they work to find, fund, and finish deals. Follow along as they share their grassroots education with you, tuition free. If you'd like to know more about what they do and to download the entire back catalog, check out notemba.com. Now, here are your hosts, Chase Thompson and Robert Woods.
Hey everybody, welcome to the Note MBA podcast, your home for note investing on iTunes. I am Chase Thompson, and on this week's show, we have a very special guest. We have Dr. Dan Wurzelmann. He is a psychiatrist in his last few days of his residency at the University of Michigan up in Ann Arbor. Very excited to have him on the show because of an interesting issue that came up a few weeks ago. I don't want to ruin the surprise for you. You'll have to listen to the episode to get that. And here's a first for anyone who's been a Note MBA listener for a long time. This week's episode is sponsored by, you guessed it, Due Diligence Pro. We actually just had our first update on the Due Diligence Pro software. It is now more stable on both the Chrome and Safari browsers. It's faster than it was before. I'm very excited about it. If you are looking to do your initial due diligence exactly like Robbie and myself do it, you've got to head over to duediligencepro.com. Get the software and start banging out your due diligence faster than you were before. Anyway, without further ado, here is our interview with Dr. Dan Wurzelmann. Hey everybody, welcome to the Note MBA podcast, your home for note investing on iTunes. I am Chase Thompson, joined as always by Mr. David Glinsky these days. And today we have a very special guest. This is the first time, I think, unless a past guest wants to yell at me and correct me, this will be the first time that we have a doctor on the show. I'm very excited about this. There is an interesting reason as to why we have him on the show today. Dr. Dan Wurzelmann, thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, guys. Thanks so much for having me on the show. Absolutely.
So before we get too into it, because I want to kind of set the stage for people as to why I invited you on the show, but I actually had to ask somebody this on the over the phone because I ran this by a couple of people to see if this would be a good idea or not. And one of the big questions I was like, wait, what's the difference? So what is the difference between a psychiatrist and a psychologist and kind of the different practices thereof?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Would you like me to sort of explain where I am too in that? You sort of introduced me as a doctor, but I can explain my position, I guess.
Yeah, for sure. Run us through it.
Yeah. So I am just finishing up the last few days of my training in psychiatry residency program. And so that becoming a psychiatrist involves doing undergraduate, then medical school, and then completing a residency in psychiatry, which is sort of like an apprenticeship where you're working as a psychiatrist, but getting supervision from senior providers. And so in psychiatry, you are able to prescribe medications. As you go through medical school, you have more familiarity with different medical conditions. And occasionally you do things like ordering labs and addressing other medical issues. And certainly one of the things we keep in mind is how people's medical problems are playing into some of their psychiatric issues. So that's what a psychiatrist does. So there's a medical background there, and that's where I'm coming from. Psychology is a little bit different. So in psychology, you do undergrad and then you go to graduate school and you can get like a PhD in psychology or also a PsyD. And if you're a clinical psychologist and seeing patients, you're going to be doing primarily therapy with patients. You don't have that medical background, so you're not doing things like writing prescriptions. And so most of the work is going to be therapy oriented.
So that was the brief way someone else explained it to me. They basically said one can write prescriptions and the other one cannot. It was essentially like the long and short of it. And it is, what is the difference between if someone actually came to work with either one? I mean, it's still kind of similar, except maybe the solving of an issue might be essentially slightly different.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think a lot of times nowadays, a lot of psychiatrists do primarily medication management. That's not universally true, but probably the majority of them are focused on medication management, at least in the outpatient or ambulatory clinic setting. So psychiatrists can do therapy. We do get therapy training over the course of our residency. And so we're familiar with a lot of the common types of therapy and how to bring those techniques into our interactions with patients. But oftentimes psychiatrists primarily end up doing medication management. So that's, if you go to a psychiatrist, typically someone would get referred to a psychiatrist, in particular if they're in need of some sort of psychiatric medication. You could also get therapy from a psychiatrist, although, as I mentioned, many psychiatrists prefer to spend their time more with medication management, and so they may actually refer you to someone else if you're just looking for therapy.
Interesting. Very cool. So again, before we dive too deeply in, the reason for my reaching out to you to kind of come on the show was because I was dealing with some issues that then bled into basically every part, right, of my life. And it kind of came to a head when we got an email through the podcast, through the show. So two quick things, because I doubt, Dan, that you listen to the show, being as this is kind of the first time we've ever talked, right? But essentially, we have really found ourselves in a really great spot with the show. We like to elicit a ton of transparency. We like to really kind of like listen to the audience and bring up and talk about it and do all those kinds of things that they want us to talk about. But we also know on the other side of that coin is the show's free, and so we do care about what people say. But at the same time, we appreciate more the constructive feedback than just random shots that we get sometimes in terms of email. Mm-hmm. And we got an email about 2 weeks ago that had the title line, and I'm not going to read it word for word or anything like that, but essentially the subject line was, "The show has become unlistenable," which was a pretty harsh subject line. And the second I saw it come across, I pretty much dropped everything to read it. And so this individual that wrote the email basically said like, "Hey, love the show. And I wanted to give you some feedback that I think is sorely needed." And they essentially just went into how the past few shows had been pretty terrible, essentially. And, he feels like I could do better and these types of things. And then, towards the end of it, basically just said like, "Hey, look," specifically addressing me. Obviously, we have David here as a co-host for today's show. And then we also have another gentleman that does a show with us named Robbie. But essentially addressing me, just saying, "Here's the things that you're doing that are really frustrating me," and this, that, and the other. So that was a little bit harsh. Not harsh in terms of his words, though.
How did that make you feel, Chase?
Yeah, exactly. How did that make you feel, right? I figured that was going to be the first question. But so it was rough. You put out this stuff and da-da-da-da. But again, we do appreciate the feedback and all that kind of stuff. And I was going to wait to respond, right? Because you don't want to respond in the moment, especially with what had been swirling. But I just did. I just thought, I'm just gonna reply. So I addressed kind of his initial stuff, and then I kind of just said, "Hey, look, without giving you an excuse, here's what's going on." Mentally and emotionally, I'd been pretty gnarled out, like very stressful. My wife and I are selling a house. I'm having to foot the entire rehab bill, which has not been particularly cheap. I've got 3 kids, dog, cat. We've got showings, so we've got to get everybody out of the house every time. Work has been, managing the show. We just launched a product called Due Diligence Pro. it's been crazy. And we haven't been sleeping because both the kids are little. I mean, it had just been, I'd gotten so overwhelmed, so stressed, so many things had come just all at once. And I had no real techniques, strategies, anything to deal with all of this. He responded with, hey, I can appreciate that. Been there, reread my message. And I don't think my words were quite as, I don't think my tone came out quite the way it did in my head as it did on paper. Thank you for everything that you've said, So that was great. But I wanted you to come on the show to kind of talk a little bit about, and I know that you mentioned obviously therapy's potentially not 100% your forte, but I don't need any prescriptions, thank you. But, as we dive into these questions, one of the things that you mentioned prior to us hitting record was that I should probably say something like the views expressed here are my own and not, the university I have a residency at. We've had lawyers on the show and things like that. We've already gone through that multiple times with other guests. So we know that obviously all that is fine, but how can we in this space, how can I, right, start to deal with some of this overwhelm, some of these stressors and things like that? Like, can you, either through examples that both David and myself can give you, or, what are some of the things that we can start to do to really, get us back to neutral, right? Like, and then move to a point of excelling, right? Because once I was so far degraded back, like the thought of even getting just back to neutral was pretty daunting. You know what I mean? So how can we start to do that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it sounds like you've had a lot of things going on, and then you noticed, particularly when you got this email, that all this stress that was going on in your life was affecting the quality of your work, affecting your sleep, and other aspects of your life too. I think one of the first key things is just recognizing that this goes for anybody, that recognizing that there's a problem and that you are getting overwhelmed and stressed out. It's actually surprisingly easy for a lot of folks to kind of keep adding more stuff to their plate without kind of acknowledging the extra burden it's placing on them, or and this can be a burden that they're sort of facing psychologically, the amount of time they're running out of, and trying to get more and more stuff done in an increasingly limited amount of time. So probably the first thing is sort of recognizing that you're running into a problem. Were you aware as you were getting to this point that you were increasingly stressed out, or was this something that was kind of below your immediate level of consciousness?
No, I was fairly aware, and, as I think most people would be, just assumed I could push through, right? Like, I felt like I've been here before, at least, like, let's say you were to gauge it, right? Like 100 to 10, right? 1 to 10 on how bad the situation is. Like, I'm like, oh, this is like a 7. I'm definitely okay. I can manage this. When in actuality, it was probably like a 12, right? So probably in your statement of just recognize is probably something along the lines of also like, be honest with yourself, like potentially about where things might actually be, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think that the first thing, the other aspect that you were mentioning is we also have a tendency to minimize stress, I think, in ourselves, and to say, we're only a 7 out of 10 when maybe it's actually a 12 out of 10. And so oftentimes our sort of, when people talk about appetite, talk about their eyes being bigger than their stomach. And I think we can apply that metaphor to other areas of life where we take on more, bite off more than we can chew, I guess, and try to take on a lot of projects, sometimes all at once, when it might be more feasible to try to spread them out. So the key thing is to sort of being able to recognize it and being in touch with yourself enough to do that. So if you are overwhelmed, everyone only has a certain capacity for doing different things. And so, sometimes if anyone is taking on, probably the amount of projects you're describing, they're probably going to feel overwhelmed and stressed out. So getting back to neutral sometimes is a matter of reorienting your schedule and trying to make life less stressful. And sometimes that involves things like reassessing your priorities and figuring out what absolutely has to get done, what can get triaged until later. So those are some of the basics. Beyond that, if you're finding that you're getting pretty overwhelmed easily, or frequently, especially by things that maybe other people don't get overwhelmed or stressed out about, there are certainly other ways to try to address that. So seeing someone like a therapist can certainly be a helpful start for recognizing different blind spots that you may have about yourself or your approach to life or solving problems. A therapist can be helpful with understanding yourself better and sort of working through that relationship with the therapist to get to understand yourself and address some of those issues. There are other things too that are helpful that don't involve as much of a commitment as going to a therapist. Like meditation is something that has some good evidence for being helpful for addressing issues with anxiety and helping people to feel calmer and more relaxed. It's not going to solve all of your problems. You can?
Yeah, I started meditation in January of this year, actually, after a kind of a messy breakup. And I was just kind of in a bad place after that. And I think meditation just really helped me find some clarity. And it sounds funny because I was that skeptic that was, how could just sitting down, closing my eyes and breathing possibly help anybody? But strangely enough, it just, maybe you can provide the science behind it, but I think it just kind of levels you out, and it helps you see the problems for what they actually are, and maybe helps you step back from seeing them so close and getting so frustrated and pent up with the problems, where you can maybe see a solution once you get a little more level-headed and step back from the problem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm glad to hear you had that experience. A lot of people report similar things, that they find they're just able to be a little bit calmer if they make a consistent practice of meditation and incorporate that into their lives.
We've discussed meditation multiple times actually on the show, which is kind of fun because we like to discuss kind of goals and what we're doing lifestyle wise and things like that. As much as we'd like to talk about the real estate side, your hesitancy towards recommending it, I can only assume is based on potential adherence, I guess, right? And then, because if I say, like, we talked about, obviously having the pharmacology side of it, right? Like if I say take this pill every day and you take the pill every day, there's adherence is a lot easier, right? Like if I say, even David just then kind of said, who thought sitting down and being quiet for a couple of minutes? Well, how many minutes and how often? And, like the actual prescription of something like meditation, I think can be incredibly tough. Not to mention there's, 20 different kinds and these types of things. So is that what makes it something that's a little bit more difficult to pin down as a potentially something that someone can do all the time?
Yeah, I wouldn't hesitate to recommend meditation. I don't know if it was coming across like that. Certainly, as you're mentioning, there can be problems with adherence to anything, be it actually medications or keeping up with therapy appointments or meditation. I mean, all of these require some level of diligence to keep up with them. And so, there can certainly be issues with that, especially for folks who are keeping very busy lives. I think it requires a particular commitment to do it. And as David mentioned, the idea of doing something like, just sitting and focusing on your breathing, for example, it may not have a lot of inherent face value or a lot of really tangible returns that you're calculating necessarily. And so I think sometimes it can be easy to overlook those sorts of things, especially if you're already pretty busy. Sure.
So I personally feel like everybody should, and this is not a plug, obviously, unless you happen to live in the Michigan, Ann Arbor area where Dan happens to be, Dr. Dan here happens to be. But I personally feel like everybody really needs to kind of see some sort of therapist or something. I've had a lot of people in my life that have made drastic changes personally and just become different. I don't want to say better people, but certainly had results in a progressive, positive manner. So I already feel like that's an obvious solution, an obvious strategy. aside from meditation and that angle, what else can we potentially be looking at to do? And I can give you some, because we actually asked a bunch of listeners and people about some issues they'd want us to bring up to you. So maybe that would be a way for us to kind of address some of that stuff. And what's super funny is that I feel like they fall into kind of like 3 different categories, regardless of what somebody said. So for me, it was, and technically 2 categories. But I would say the number one thing that everybody mentioned in varying different ways of saying it, right? Because like everybody kind of said it differently, but essentially fear, managing fear. So like some people said, the fear of pulling a trigger on a particular deal, or the fear of missing out, right? Like you do all this work and every single time something comes in, what we get in this business, because you don't know, we get these things called tapes, and it's essentially an Excel spreadsheet of all of the potential loans or mortgages and things like that a bank or hedge fund might have available for purchase, right? So you get this new tape in and you absolutely drop everything because you have this fear of missing out, right? It's in tech world, they call it FOMO, right? This fear of missing out on a deal. So a lot of people mentioned it differently, but fear is a really big one. And I think there's a well-seated place for it when I go and I'm spending, let's say I brought in private capital and I went to you, Dan, you're a doctor. I said, oh, Dan, what are you doing for your investments? You're like, oh, I'm doing nothing. And I'm like, oh, da-da-da. And then I go spend potentially, have an opportunity to spend $100,000 of your money, right? Like that's, you shouldn't take it lightly, right? There should be a little bit of that healthy fear there, but with everybody kind of said it in a different way, like this fear of this, that, or something else. Any strategies to maybe deal with something like that?
Well, Chase, as you're saying, there is fear can be an adaptive thing, and in our anxiety clinics, we often think about the sort of basis for fear and why we have anxiety in the first place, and so it's normal and healthy to have anxiety when you're encountering scary or dangerous things, and so I think that it's going to be a little bit different for every person. For example, if someone is constantly feeling anxious and they're constantly ruminating about every single deal or opportunity, and they're running through their to-do list or their checklist, or they're replaying different, say, social situations or different interactions in their mind over and over again, to the point where they're impaired in their functioning for doing other things. Like maybe you're trying to spend some time with your kids at home in the evening, for example, but you keep getting distracted by these intrusive thoughts from work. That can be a point where the anxiety is too much. And when it gets to that point, I guess, each person's anxiety can be driven by slightly different things. It's hard to give specific advice for a really general situation. So some signs that things could be excessive could be problems with sleep, for example, getting easily distracted by your worries when you're trying to do other things, feeling just really restless, irritable. Those would be probably some of the most common signs that someone's anxiety has gotten to too great a degree. Certainly if someone's having problems like panic attacks, where someone is having feelings of shortness of breath or chest pain, feelings of a sense of impending doom, those sorts of things, that would definitely be signs that it'd be helpful to go see a professional for an evaluation to try to address some of those issues.
I was actually curious about because I was in the space that Chase was talking about before, as far as the FOMO, the fear of missing out. I've been, or you could call it the analysis paralysis. I've been looking at these tapes, these spreadsheets of notes, and just kind of feeling overwhelmed with where to start and how to do things. And thankfully, if it wasn't for Robbie, I wouldn't actually, I would just keep putting it off day to day. But I kind of have like a 2-part question. First of all, how would one kind of, I don't know. I know you said there isn't an end-all solution to everybody's problem because everybody's problems is different. But how could somebody, I guess the best way to ask this would be, pinpoint exactly what's giving them anxiety. So like looking at the tape, I couldn't tell if it was the number of tape or the number of assets that was bothering me to scrub through, or if it was the prices of the assets, or if it was spending other people's money that I've like acquired access to. So what would be like a good way for me to self-analyze and try to figure out where the anxiety is coming from?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good question, and that's often something that's hard to figure out. One of the fascinating things about anxiety and tricky aspects of it is that sometimes we feel anxious, but it is hard to pinpoint exactly why we feel anxious about things, and sometimes we'll even attribute our anxiety to other factors. And it's tough to really do a lot of self-analysis, I think, and pinpoint things down to kind of, if we step back for a minute and think about anxiety disorders more generally, the way that our anxiety system works is whenever we're in a particularly scary or anxious situation, our brain makes a strong memory of that. And it'll remember a lot of features of the situation, even if those features aren't necessarily dangerous. So like, for example, if one of our early ancestors was out on the savannah and encountered a dangerous predator like a lion, for example, that person would probably get really scared, especially if the lion was aggressive. And that person would make a really strong memory of that, assuming they survive and escape. And next time that person sees a lion, even if the lion's far away, that person's going to be a little bit more on edge and more cautious. Let's say there were some other features of that particular scene, like a particular type of grass or particular types of trees. Some of those other features of the scene might actually still leave some memory if the anxiety response was strong enough in that really scary moment. And so some of those things could still trigger anxiety. So for example, in the situation that you're describing, David, there's some aspect of say looking over that Excel sheet that's provoking anxiety, and there could be various aspects of it that may end up triggering your anxiety, even though it's perhaps not the part that is most anxiety provoking to you, but it just has become associated with this broader anxiety and is still bringing up these same feelings of anxiousness or worry.
And it's because that self-evaluation, right, can be so difficult. Even though, like you even asked right on the start of this, right? Like, did you notice, or was it like even below your consciousness to know that like things were, starting to spiral a little bit? Even when you see those moments, it still can be tough to self-evaluate. And do you find that often?
I do find that often, and I've actually been fairly impressed myself with how often I may not be aware of something that's causing me anxiety until it eventually comes up. In our training to be a psychiatrist, it actually used to be required for psychiatrists to get their own therapy. Now it's just optional, but I am in therapy, and I do find it helpful, and I've learned more about myself and what things that have been causing me some anxiety or discomfort or have been making me unhappy that I wasn't really aware of. I just kind of had these feelings of feeling overwhelmed or feeling stressed out or feeling upset about something that would come up from time to time. But I've been able to better identify some of those through some of my own work in therapy. And I guess to me, that's been something that you feel like you know yourself better than anyone else can. And there's a lot of truth in that. But sometimes it also is helpful to work with another person to try to understand yourself even better. And so that's why I tend to say that we often aren't as aware of ourselves as we think. And even I guess this goes back to the very old days of psychiatry with Freud and talking about things like the unconsciousness and the consciousness. So I do think that there's a lot to be said for not understanding ourselves as well as we sometimes think we do, and also the difficulties we can have in just trying to figure it all out, just relying on ourselves.
So the next issue that some people had brought up, and this might feed into the question I was going to ask, was the issue of scaling, right? So like scaling your business and the process of planning for planning for fear, planning for overwhelm, planning for these things that we haven't seen, in the real estate space that we're in, at any potential time. I mean, part of the issue I was having when I originally got that email, I had 3 deals that were outstanding that were in different forms of like needing either to be funded or one was, one really needed to sell. I absolutely needed this deal to go through. And then, every deal, right? You absolutely needed to go through, right? And there's just so many zeros behind some of the things that we do and potential mistakes that we can make. And it seems to me like when people get into this business, when they can, 1 deal to 5 deals management is pretty good, right? You sound like someone who's obviously not in this space, but you could get your head wrapped around it pretty quick. I think most people could do like 1 to 5. 5 to 10 starts to get a little bit murkier, but your learning curve is kind of shifted such that gets a little bit easier. The small gap of what is, potentially 10 to 20, but it seems like a chasm. And then 20 plus is a whole other ballpark. And then on, right? So, what is it? Things like stepping back and doing the self-evaluation, maybe having conversations about your business with other people in business, the networking aspect, different things. What are some things that people can do? Because that was the next kind of big thing, right? Was like systems and processes and strategies for scaling and things like that. Almost like dealing with the overwhelm before it even comes. Like, how can I shield myself prior to impact, if at all possible?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I'll try to answer it as well as I understand it, but feel free to add in some more. Obviously, it's great if you're able to anticipate things that are going to be stressful and to have some backup plans and contingency options in case things don't go as well as you hope they will. That in itself, just some planning ahead can certainly be very helpful. Inevitably, there are going to be times where, a bunch of things don't go well in a row and you end up feeling stressed out and overwhelmed anyway. And so sometimes that's really tough to avoid.
In particular, it definitely is it's not that you can see it coming. Maybe it's a case of needing to be a better listener or a better action taker against the listening, right? We've talked about it a lot on the show. I mean, this will be episode 128, of the show. So it's not like we're brand new. We've brought this up before about how moving into different levels of deals you're either doing or have done and things like that really bring a different level of a different level of difficulty. And so we've said it 100 times. We've known it ourselves. And yet at the turn of this year, we just about, lost our minds because our systems were not such that we could handle what was going on. Like things were really starting to kind of become an issue. So we did essentially what you said earlier, right? Like almost full stop and started to take things off our plate as quickly as we can and different things like that. So for me, we have a lot of new investors that listen to the show and a lot of investors that are in that interim space of it's about to get, it could potentially get hairy and, understanding, strengthening yourself against that either anxiety or fear or difficulty that might come from increased expectation, increased,
like how to prepare for the bad times is what.
Mm-hmm. Preparing for the bad times. Well, I think that incorporating general balance into your life from the get-go is important. And so if you have some good balance and then things get out of balance, it's easier to rebalance them. If things are already pretty hairy and at their maxes before something bad happens and you're sort of living on the edge already, then it's just much harder to recover and bounce back from a series of misfortunes. So one would be just trying to incorporate balance in your life, doing things like exercising daily, trying to eat a healthy diet, incorporating some mindfulness practices can be helpful. Those things I think are generally just of great benefit overall. So those are always good places to start. Now it's possible to do those things and to still push yourself too far. But I think those are good starts. As I've mentioned before, go ahead.
I think you can touch on being mindful a little bit, because I know I know that Chase and me both listen to Gary Vaynerchuk. I'm not sure if you know about him, but he's a businessman that really talks a lot about being self-aware and mindful and just knowing yourself. So are there any ways that you know of to be more mindful or self-aware?
As far as being more mindful goes, certainly meditation is one of the more popular ways of trying to be more mindful. Simply spending some time in reflection, thinking about things, sort of hitting the brakes periodically to there's different sorts of activities that are designed to help people relax and be more in the moment. Things like yoga or progressive muscle relaxation. Those are different things that are ideally designed to help people take a little bit of time out and be more present and hopefully reduce their stress. So those would be some places that someone could start or expand their mindfulness practices.
Mm-hmm. One of the issues that I have is understanding that I'm not the only one might be dealing with this sometimes, right? Like, that I think was we tend to just retreat a little bit, I think, at least I do, when it comes to finding these moments and finding these times of, dealing, say, with growth or with a scaling issue or with, for me, it wasn't just business, right? It was a ton of life stuff. It was a ton of business stuff. It was I was just getting hit from so many different sides that it was crazy to think that it wasn't going to start really bleeding in and causing issues. And so, how helpful has it been for you to see in your practice and in the people that you've worked with to have that network around them and mm-hmm. really build that up before, nobody you really, well, I guess we know plumbers, but most people don't know the plumber or the roofing guy or whatever until they have that problem, right? But like, how important mm-hmm. is it? Have you seen it in your practice and things like that to help people understand that, man, that group of people around you is unreal. Like it can be so helpful and build that out before you need it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, certainly. I actually see that a lot. And I think the idea you're getting at is just the idea of social support in general, which is really key for someone to be able to be functioning well and to be able to, have a pretty healthy, balanced life and to be able to be productive. And so that can take a variety of shapes. So, perhaps I know a lot of entrepreneurs do things like mastermind groups where they work with a bunch of peers and have maybe accountability partners. And it's a way to sort of bounce ideas off of each other and also discuss your both your moments of triumph, but also some of the trials and tribulations that you encounter. And you can bounce ideas. It kind of becomes a support group in some ways, which you can work with each other to help each other sort out various problems you come into. So, that can be on a professional level. It can also be other connections that you have, be it friends or family, other social circles that you may run in. I think that having that support network is also very important. It can provide a lot of helpful functions, from just having, a nice social escape to do something fun and take your mind off of some of the stresses in a healthy way, to also just providing other, peer-to-peer advice on how to handle situations or how someone else was able to navigate a similar difficult situation. So I definitely agree that social support is a really important key for keeping yourself, mentally healthy. So
don't be too proud to bring up that, bring up when you're having issues and things. Definitely, that is an issue I have had in the past, and will probably potentially continue to have in the future as I work through some of this stuff. So I appreciate you coming on, obviously, and talking about all this stuff, and at least getting us into a space where, a lot of people come to us, right, for like the real estate talk. What deals are you guys talking about? Breaking down different strategies and all that kind of stuff. I don't know of any other real estate podcast that's had, a psychiatrist on to not talk about their real estate portfolio, right? To actually talk about these things, and the solutions seem like a lot of really great things in life. They seem really simple, but then we just don't do them, right? Because I feel like the simplicity of it almost like negates the action, right? You're like, oh, meditate a little bit. Yeah, I'll do that. That sounds pretty easy, sitting in a chair, and then I'm never going to go do that thing. Or yeah, building up my network and talking openly. Oh, with the people around me in a mastermind. That's, and sometimes we do, and most of the times we don't. That vulnerability can be really hard, I think, for a lot of people to get to. And so I would just like to, I would hope that anybody who's listening to the show, and kind of hasn't made it this far, right? They're like, we're not talking about real estate amount. But anybody that, listens to this really understands how important this is and how big of an impact this can have on your business. Because I've just experienced how quickly things can start to spiral. And then you forget to send an email, you forget to pay a water bill, you forget to do this, you forget to pay a tax, you forget to do these different things. And then the compounding, right? We all love compound interest, but then there's also the other side of that, right? Which is the compounding of problems that you're not dealing with. So, I do appreciate you coming on and really helping me, anybody else that doesn't want any help, you can, whatever, we'll be back next week talking about more real estate, right? But, helping me really understand that stuff. Like it is okay to talk about it. It is okay to be, the importance of the self-awareness and the vulnerability, insofar as like, hey man, I'm really struggling with this. Firing off an email, a phone call, an in-person message, obviously going to see somebody if that's an area that you're finding yourself in, right? But that this stuff just happens even to, like you said, it used to be required, but now it's optional. But like even as a psychiatrist, you're like, oh gosh, I should probably go. I've found so much help in going to see somebody, right? I wasn't even able to recognize some of these scenarios. That just seems so. I don't feel like it's like letting me off the hook, but it definitely is refreshing to know that like, oh, whew, I'm not the only one that's like, oh gosh. That's great, and I appreciate that.
Mm-hmm. Well, good. I'm glad you found that helpful. And I really think that you hit on something important there, that it's very difficult to be vulnerable. I think especially, for folks that are very motivated and have been high achieving, being vulnerable is often very difficult to do. And it can be very tough, but ultimately it can be very rewarding if you're able to overcome a difficulty that you're having. And so it's very tough to do, but can have great payoffs in the long run if you're able to seek the help that you need.
Dan, I do appreciate it very much. And to be honest with you, I was trying to find somebody to come on the show, and I couldn't really get anybody that understood why I wanted them to come on. They were really kind of confused. And so then I was like, oh man, how am I going to do this? And I was like, oh, why don't I just find a psychiatrist that has a podcast? This will be way easier, right? Like, because they'll get it, they'll understand the medium. Though you said you do most of your interviews in person, which I love. But if you guys are interested, we will have a link to Dan's podcast in the show notes. It's called Learn Psych, I believe. Is that right?
Yep, Learn Psych Podcast.
Yeah, the Learn Psych Podcast. And it's geared more towards like the medical students or people that are probably in the medical field looking for that info, education, that type of stuff regarding psychiatry. But I assume there's probably going to be a lot of applicable stuff, just about life in general, on top of probably some other stuff that you have there. Or if maybe you have a spouse that's in that field, I'm sure they would love it. But I appreciate it, man. I really, really do. If for nothing else, just understanding that, one, obviously we've got the techniques. Two, understanding that like these feelings aren't weird, and I'm not, our audience size is X big, and the people that responded when we said we were going to have someone come on and talk about these things was an order of magnitude smaller. So that made me all of a sudden feel like, oh crap, I really am one of the only people that's struggling with this. But understanding that isn't the case is it's almost half the battle, right? Because then that opens you up to at least potentially stopping and going, maybe I do need to hit the brakes for a second and either find a group or find somebody, or, just at the very least, start to do some self-assessment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, thank you guys for having me on, Chase and David. I appreciate it. It's been good to talk to you. Hope that this has been helpful.
Absolutely, man. Well, we will, whenever you start your real estate portfolio in a couple of years, once you're settled into your own practice, we'll have you back on the show. It'll be great. It'll just be a nice little throwback. It'll be awesome. Thank you so much. As always, guys, be sure to head over to iTunes, give us a rating, give us a review, and of course, subscribe. Everything we've talked about, including a link to Dan's podcast, will be in the show notes over at NoteMBA.com. And as always, be sure to tell 5 other people you know this week about the Note MBA podcast. Catch you guys next week, where we'll be talking about real estate again. Bye, guys.